I told them to make me like a PowerPoint. People, doesn't matter they have paper. Because you can't both.
They will have the PowerPoint at the end.
Yeah, but only not from can't both. Really, it's just that.
Oh, right. Okay. Take care.
Fine, cool. Then we've worked through this.
Okay.
Maxine, do you want to put something on Facebook stats on? Maxine,
What?
do we put something stats on now?
Yep, I'm putting it up now. Thank you. But not until it's a good size.
It's not very on like the others.
We should see the comment.
Let's see.
Working? Yeah.
Maxine. What?
Okay, hello and welcome finally. We do apologise for the delay. This is Aslea Vic's first time at live streaming, and we've been working on it all weekend, and I have to say a big thank you to Niaz from VicDev who's helped us finally get it up and running today. So thanks Niaz for all your work. Welcome to everybody who's here today in Victoria. And just for the benefit of those that are watching via the live stream, we've probably got about 30 people in attendance, so a mixture of Auslan interpreters and deaf interpreters. So welcome to you all here in Victoria. We've also got live stream groups happening in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, and there's a few odd people here and there watching the feed as well. There's also some regional Victorian people watching, so be interesting to know how many people we have in total, but there's certainly a fair few here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Maxine Buxton. I'm the president of Aslea Vic. We've also got in attendance some other wonderful Aslea Vic people, namely Janaea and Georgia, that you would have met on your way in. And we have our official reps from Aslea that are here this evening. We have Ben Suter, who's just sitting in our audience in Victoria. We also have Teresa Cumston-Bird, there she is at the back, and we also have Neil Ray, who is on Aslea at a national level also. So, I'd like to welcome you all near and far officially, and I'd like to introduce our two presenters for this evening. We have Laurie Wynott, who will be speaking about the work she's been doing with the ASLEA Deaf Interpreter Subcommittee and the work that that committee has done with NAATI to make these changes come about. And we also have Robert Foote, who is the Accreditation Manager at NAATI. So he's going to give you a little bit of a perspective from NAATI. So before I hand over to them, I would just like to say a big thank you to VicDeaf and Sign Language Communications for sponsoring and providing the venue and the live streaming support while we're here. And as I said, we've got Niaz and Sasha's on the camera. So if you do come out and ask a question, people in Victoria, you need to come to the front of the room, stand in the little box and either speak or sign your question. For those of you that are watching remotely, you can type on our Facebook page any comments or questions you might have. That's being monitored all through the evening, and we will raise questions when they're relevant throughout the session. So hopefully we'll be able to monitor all of the technology successfully. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Laurie. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'm really thrilled to see so many people here, and also some of you who are out there in other venues. It's fantastic. I'm going to start off signing for just a little bit, and then I'll swap over to using my voice, using English, because I'm still picking up Auslan. I want to first of all just outline who I am and how I got involved in deaf interpreting and the recognition process. So first off, I'm a hearing person from another country, and you may wonder why I got involved. Well, basically, I've been working with deaf interpreters in America and other countries for the last 20 years, and so it's something that I'm very, very thrilled to be a part of. I also know that deaf interpreters have got skills in their first language, so I feel that they provide valuable input, and it's important to have them involved and the skills involved into our profession. And in my experience, before I moved to Australia 3 years ago, I wanted to look at NAATI and its recognition myself, because I wanted to become accredited, because I'm an ASL interpreter and have been for the last 22 years. So for me, I had to go through a process of recognition. And I know for deaf interpreters, I thought, yeah, it would be something that they would need to go through as well. So ASLEA asked me to get involved in this group, and I thought, why not? I thought it was a vital issue, and that's why I'm here. So I would love it if there would be more deaf people be part of the committee, because we really need your viewpoints. So that's just something I want to put out there. So now I'm going to speak, because I'm not as fluent in Auslan as I'd like to be. If it was in ASL, it would be fine, but I think I will use English.
Okay. I want to start out. I had asked a few minutes ago how many people here with us here in Victoria are deaf, and it seems like there's a. I'm going to ask you one more time so I can count and tell whatever how many people are here. How many deaf people are in the audience? We've got about 10, 15 deaf people in the audience. And how many of you are deaf interpreters and work as deaf interpreters? About five people in the room. Okay. And how many hearing interpreters are in the room? We've got about 7 or 8 hearing people here. Okay, that's great. I want to start out by giving a little bit of a background, a little bit of history to how we got here to deaf interpreter recognition. you probably have heard, as of the ANC recently, in October, that there's now available recognition for deaf interpreters. But people in Australia, interpreters in Australia, have been pushing for the professionalization of deaf interpreters for a while, long before I even got involved. So there are other people who have wanted to see this happen, and there are plenty of you out there who've been doing the work for a while. There have been some previous trainings in other states over the past 10 years or more, and there were also efforts in the late 2007, 2008, with there was an effort to document work task analysis of the work of deaf interpreters and to look at the competencies. And this came out of the certification project, the Deaf Relay Interpreter Certification Project. That was a joint effort by NABS, ASLEA, and had some support from Macquarie University. So they were able to identify, obviously, the need for establishing some credential, establishing training, and they made some recommendations. So there are, obviously, deaf interpreters working, but there's no professional recognition or continued training for people. And ASLEA has been committed ongoing to the issue of deaf interpreter qualification. And so what had happened with ASLEA in their negotiation and discussion with NADI over the past several years was that, and even just this past year, recognition seemed to be sort of the viable pathway, this sort of first step to begin with, because of some of the complicated issues around establishing a qualification exam, making sure that there was training available, trying to figure out how many people, what was the need out there, lots of other complicating factors. Meanwhile, deaf interpreters have been continuing to work. We do need to get some recognition for this. So last year, in January of 2013, ASLEA authorized the DI, the Deaf Interpreter Subcommittee, and it was originally named the DRI Subcommittee, but ASLEA had received feedback from the community, and it seemed to be that people preferred the term deaf interpreter, mainly because interpreters are interpreting. Deaf interpreters are doing interpretation. They're not just doing the relay, they're actually processing the language from a language into some sort of contact situation, or they're working from a written English text into Auslan, so they're working with languages. So ASLEA National asked me to take the lead and had already identified a handful of people who were invested in the issue and invited them to be part of this sort of subcommittee to do work on deaf interpreter recognition. There wasn't a response from everybody, but there were a few key people who were very much involved. I have to obviously mention Robin Sakazi. She's past ASLEA Western Australia president, and she's involved in NADI as well, in the Western Australia region. Is that right, Robert? And also Patty Gray was involved at the outset and has given some advice on this process. Steph Linder, who's actually with us today, she gave some advice on the issue. And Karen Bontempo as well from Western Australia. So this group of people were pretty active, as well as we had some great advising from Dylan Oswell, who had been involved for quite some time on the issue. So in March of last year, I began working with Robert, and we started drafting the process for this DI recognition. We went back and forth with a couple of ideas around the application, working within NADI's already existing recognition process. And by September, what we had come up with was submitted to the QAC, which is the quality, what does it stand for?
Qualification Assessment Advisory Committee.
Qualification Assessment Advisory Committee of NADI. And the paperwork, the application, the instructional booklet was approved by them, and then it went on to the NADI board for approval. And that's when ASLEA National was able to announce at the ANC that we had a process in place for DI recognition. And then this past December 10th, I believe was the date, the first two DIs were recognized. They were granted recognition and a ceremony in Perth. So we're really excited to see that that's happened. And the hope is, of course, yay, definitely yay, we're hoping that more people who are interested in becoming recognized, if you're doing the work, you have work experience, that you want to go through the process of getting recognition. And Robert is going to talk a bit more about that process while he's here today. What we came up with was, it had been identified that we didn't really think that a generalist deaf interpreter recognition was going to suffice for the needs of the community and for people who are hiring deaf interpreters. People have skills in different areas. There are different skills that a deaf interpreter might work with. Some might actually work primarily with deaf-blind consumers. Others may do sight translation. Other DIs might be doing work with people who have some sort of cognitive disability or use some sort of disfluent sign language that's not full Auslan. And some DIs work in all of these areas. So it made sense in some of our discussion in the subcommittee to come up with a couple of areas of competencies for people to be able to apply for, so that the entities who are hiring them would know, okay, this person is skilled in these areas. And it also allows for identifying what areas of training might be needed going forward in the future. So what we've come up with was these 5 skill areas. First being the DI working between Auslan and what's called a non-conventional sign language, which means basically someone who's using a sign language that it's either not regular Auslan, or they might actually be using a home sign system, something that's not conventionalized, maybe to a village community. They might have moved here as a migrant. Their sign language isn't even recognized or documented. So that's that particular skill. The next skill level pertains to working between written English into this sort of non-conventional sign language. Sometimes deaf interpreters will work maybe at a medical appointment with somebody and they're sight translating forms that the deaf client needs to understand. There's also the skill of being able to work with adapted Auslan. So adapting your Auslan, going from Auslan into an adapted Auslan for someone who has low vision or is deafblind. And it's not just deaf interpreters who can work with some of these particular areas as well. So this is part of the recommendation made from the research that was done by Della and that group of people who worked on the DRICP, that some of these skill areas are actually things that Auslan English interpreters do, but it's good to sort of note that this is part of the skill set of interpreters in general, but it's put in DI recognition at this point. The 4th skill area, recognition area, would be working between Auslan and another conventional sign language. NADI is responsible for providing accreditation for interpreters who work between languages that they actually test. And so recognition is the process for someone to get professional recognition to be able to work in Australia with a language that NADI doesn't test. And so we all know there are other sign languages, and some of you deaf interpreters actually work with people who come from other countries, and you may be familiar with that country's sign language. And lastly, the skill area would be working between written English and Auslan. So actually doing sight translation from written English or some sort of written English text into Auslan, or either live for somebody, or it actually, I think, applies to doing work for video translations for broadcasting from media. That skill would fall under that area. So those are the 5 areas of recognition. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Robert to talk a bit about NADI and the application process and how that all operates. And once he does that, we'll actually open up for some questions from people, and we'll see what you all are thinking and what questions you have coming in this evening.
If I don't use the microphone, then people Are they able to hear me all right, or is it better? I'm not sure if the microphone is working. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So my official title at NAATI is Accreditation Manager. I have very broad areas of responsibility within my job title. So I deal with accreditation and recognition systems, both the design of those systems and the team of people who deal with processing any applications that we get. I deal with feedback that we get from stakeholders about systems. So these are people who may have failed tests, but also organisations like ASLIA and OSIT. So that it's an incredibly broad role and very interesting because of that. More recently, I've become involved in looking forward as well and looking at how the NAATI system may change into the future, and I'll mention that briefly at the end of my presentation. A lot of what we'll talk about tonight has only come about thanks to the work and advice from Lauren. So we relied on her very heavily during the process of the actual design of the application form, what information would be needed in the application process. But we also had some input from the Australian Deafblind Council, and I spoke a couple of times to Geraldine Milroy from the Australian Deafblind Council as well. Much of what I'll talk about is the actual process for applying for recognition, but I think it's important to give you a little bit of background about NAATI before I do that. And also I will talk about revalidation. So this is the process of retaining your recognition in, as a deaf interpreter once it's granted, and also about something that we call the improvements and testing project, which really affects all aspects of the NAATI system, including recognition in the long term. Okay, so quickly about NAATI. Apologies for my poor use of technology. Some of you may or may not know much about NAATI. Originally, we were established in 1977, with the first accreditations being granted about 1979, primarily driven out of demand from migrant communities that arrived in Australia in the 40s, 50s, 60s. At that time, there were a number of goals set for NAATI, what it was intended to achieve. Most of which have not changed since that time. One of them is about developing, translating and interpreting to meet community needs. While we were originally established as part of the then Immigration Department, we were re-established in 1984 as a private company, but our owners are actually the state and Commonwealth governments of Australia. So that is quite an interesting environment to work within. Up until about November last year, the Commonwealth Government Department with responsibility for NAATI was the Immigration Department. What was DIAC and is now another acronym I can't remember, Department of Immigration and Border Protection. But from November last year, we've actually transitioned to the Department of Social Services. There was a lot about that transition we still don't know, but I think there's certainly hope within NAATI that that transition to a different government department will bring positive things in terms of where government would like NAATI to focus its efforts and time. Okay, a little bit about NAATI recognition. It's a separate award from accreditation. It is offered in situations where accreditation by testing is not available. So it doesn't mean that for some languages there aren't accredited people where there's not accreditation by testing, because a good example is Danish or Swedish. They're quite well established. There's quite well established education in translating and interpreting in those languages in those countries. So you can actually get accreditation based on your overseas qualification. So broadly speaking, recognition is only awarded in situations where NAATI doesn't offer an accreditation test. Currently, we offer accreditation testing in about 60 languages. Recognition is granted in languages historically of low community demand for which NAATI does not offer accreditation testing. That means in the history of NAATI we have awarded recognition in about 120 languages. They range from some of the indigenous languages of Australia through to what you might regard as well-established European languages like Danish and Swedish that I talked about before. Recognition is an acknowledgement at the time of award that the candidate had recent and regular experience as a translator or interpreter, but no level of proficiency is specified as part of the credential. What that means is, anytime NAATI awards accreditation, there is some form of objective assessment of an interpreter or a translator's ability to transfer meaning between the two languages. Recognition, there isn't that assessment. What we're saying in a recognition process is there's an assumption made that if someone cannot do the job, no one would provide a work reference, basically, for the individual. So a lot of emphasis is placed on the work reference in the recognition process. Now, a number of languages over the years have transitioned from being a recognised language to being a language where there is accreditation testing. Primarily in the past, that transition has been based on community demand for interpreting in that language. But, you know, as I said, we've now moved to having Department of Social Services as primary input to NAATI's goals and focus. So that may change, and we may transition away from this idea of it's demand driven to some other form of process to transition from recognition to transition. When we started this process, there was already a framework for recognition for spoken languages. And so the process we went through very much was saying, how can this general framework be applied to deaf interpreters? Okay. This is stuff probably everyone knows about. So in October last year, there was actually a formal announcement that NAATI would make available these credentials. And I think, as Laurie mentioned, we've already awarded 2 individuals deaf interpreter credentials, and I think we have at least a couple of more applications that have come in this year. Okay. The process. So on NAATI's website, which is www.naati.com.au, and unlike other websites, you do actually have to put the www in for some reason. If you just put naati.com.au, you don't get our website. Don't ask me how we managed to do that. We've managed to create our website in such a way that it doesn't work. So the application form can be found on the website. It sets out the requirements. There are requirements around recent passport photographs, and they have to be witnessed in a particular way by someone on a particular list. The primary reason for this is that on occasion, and in my 10 years at NAATI, it's probably only happened 5 or 6 times, we do actually get asked, is this the person that actually holds the NAATI credential? And having a photo of the individual is useful in that ID process. I'm not aware of it ever happening within Auslan, but there are some languages where people feel they can send a friend along to do their work for them who isn't actually NAATI accredited. there is a requirement around certified copy of a passport. It doesn't have to be any passport, or an Australian driver's license. This is around photo ID, and it's very much for the same reason. It's, we use the name on that document on our system as the formal record of identity for the individual. Now, this is of less importance for recognition because the fee is the same irrespective of whether you're an Australian citizen, permanent resident or not, but we do also ask for evidence of residency status. But if you're providing an Australian passport, for example, then you only need to provide one document. In terms of the specific requirements of DI recognition, there are three. One is, or in some cases four, but primarily three. Evidence of Auslan proficiency, and where you are looking to be recognised in a combination of Auslan and another formal standardised sign language, then evidence of proficiency in the other sign language. Completion of a short training course in DI, and work experience. Now, there are fees associated with the application process. If you have not applied to NAATI for any sort of credential previously, you pay currently, in the current financial year, an $110 application fee, plus a $202 processing fee for your recognition. Just a little bit more detail about each of the requirements. So I won't go through each of these. These are set out in the information booklet. So when you go to the DI recognition link on our webpage, there's links to two documents. One is the application form, and the other one is the information booklet. So, you know, there are a number of criteria, or there are a number of things that we will accept as evidence of Auslan proficiency. We spoke at length about the relative merits, and if people feel that something has been missed from that list, we're always willing to reconsider it or to review it. Typically, that would only happen for any new forms from the 1st of July each year. The second requirement around training. The first is the actual document you provide to NAATI. So you need to provide a certified copy of proving that you've completed a NAATI endorsed deaf interpreting course. Now, in the information booklet, we have listed some of the ones that Laurie knew about or was able to provide information about that had existed in the past. But even then, in the late last year, someone asked a question about a course that we haven't discussed that had been run in New South Wales as part of Auslan, I can't remember now the specifics of it, but we were, through various links, we were able to find information about that course, and it did meet the requirements. Primarily, there's a minimum standard for acceptance around hours and content. This is the same criteria that's set for recognition in other languages around the content of any acceptable training. As I said, where someone makes an application and we don't have any background information on the course, we may actually ask for additional information. Sometimes I can go to Laurie or other contacts and they're able to provide the information. But sometimes we may actually come back to the person making the application. A lot of the time, all we're looking for is someone who may have been involved in running the course or have records of attendance. Work experience, now I said before, that is the primary basis on which NAATI recognition is granted. Without work experience as a DI, you are not eligible for NAATI recognition. The application process does enable people to make an application and complete some of the requirements after the application's been made, but we would not accept an application without evidence of work experience. And when I mean we won't accept it, we would still process the fee associated with it. So people need to be very careful when they're making the application. The fee is not associated with the granting of recognition, it's for the processing of the application. I think we have a question.
I've got a list of questions, but one related to that specifically. If I, say for example, don't have any work experience, but I need the recognition in order to get employment, it's a little bit like, does the chicken or the egg come first? And how can I move forward with being able to get recognised or registered in an interpreter agency if I don't have recognition?
I think this is an issue that we grasp with any recognition. It's been looked at a number of times, and unfortunately it's a situation where we need some assurance in granting a recognition that an individual understands how to behave ethically, that they can actually go out and perform as a DI. Certainly it's something that we can talk to ASLEA more broadly about what opportunities there might be. So you may be able to, there might be some sort of mentoring arrangement that can be established so that someone already with recognition mentors someone without recognition through a process so that work reference can be granted. But we are very much, as I said, we had a framework that we had to function within for recognition. So work experience is part of that framework. So yes, we understand that in some instances an agency will not put you on the books unless you have a credential and you have recognition. But that really is a situation where that was something that's non-negotiable as part of the process. We're quite happy to listen to feedback about what options may be available to provide alternatives, but there will need to be some evidence of work experience as part of any recognition process for any language.
I'm also going to respond to that as well. That was one of the challenges even for me when I applied for recognition as an ASL interpreter, and I was a freelance interpreter for most of my career, so for hundreds and hundreds of organizations, but chasing down letters that said that I indeed did a contract job for them was difficult. So if you as a deaf interpreter have experience providing interpreting, you have work experience and someone has hired you and paid you to do it, it's about getting documentation, is that correct? That someone has actually paid you to do the work, and on the application it notes the work you did, how many hours, and that sort of thing.
It doesn't have to be paid.
Oh, okay.
So the other thing is it doesn't have to be paid work. So we don't use volunteer work, we use pro bono work. So there's no requirement that an individual is paid for the work they do. What we do need to be sure of is that the organisation or individual providing the reference understands the difference between, I suppose, bilingual work compared with interpreting. And we deal with a lot of issues more broadly with recognition where people will provide references from their local church, from organisations where they may work bilingually. So in other words, they do their job, they just do it in English and another language. And that's not sufficient for recognition. We want the evidence that someone has worked as an interpreter.
I've got more questions, but I will ask them a bit later.
Okay. Work experience requires a minimum of 2 work referees indicating current work experience, and this is for each of the 5 skills that Laurie was talking about previously. So the actual form has different boxes that the referee can tick for each of the skills. So you simply don't get recognised in all 5 simply because you had some work experience. You must have specific work experience in each The form, as well as requiring the referee to fill out a section, also requires the referee to provide a letter on letterhead from the organisation that they work for. And so normally we receive the original copy of that letter, but we will accept certified. And on occasions where the reference is unclear, we do contact the person providing the reference clarification, and particularly around this issue of bilingual work versus interpreting. Yeah. I haven't put this on the slide, but in terms of once you've applied to NAATI about the process, once we receive an application, the first step is we basically put you onto our computer system, you're given a NAATI number, we take your money, and you will get an invoice for payment for the application. That usually happens less than 1 week from when you've submitted your application. After that, there may be a 2 to 4 week delay while we actually process the content of the application. If anything additional is needed or we need clarification about anything, we will email the individual who has made the application. As I said, it's normally 2 to 4 weeks, but in some cases, for example, where we need to chase a reference or someone who's provided a reference and they're slow getting back to us and can be longer than. You will always get a letter from NAATI at some point in time advising you of the outcome of the recognition, but there's no time limit. So, for example, if we come back to you and say, oh, you know, we're quite happy to accept this reference, but we need a second one, a lot of the time, despite the form asking for 2, people will only provide 1. We won't write and turn down your recognition application on that basis. We will simply say, you know, you need to get that to us, and we'll hold your application. Normally, after 6 to 9 months of holding an application, we'll email an individual and say, well, we haven't got the additional information from you. We're going to file that application and issue a letter saying it's been unsuccessful, but we'll only do it after 6 to 9 months. Once you're awarded recognition, that means that you can get a NAATI ID card, so showing that you're a NAATI recognised interpreter, and for DI it will list each of the skills that you've been awarded NAATI recognition in, or a NAATI certificate. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, NAATI awards a certificate for each recognition that you hold. So, in fact, if you receive recognition in all 5 skills, that's actually 5 certificates. That's something we'll have to look at in the future. But that's unfortunately our computer system was set up in such a way that it just doesn't handle being flexible. That's the way. Yeah, if there's questions, I'm quite happy.
I'd just like to say that I got my accreditation through RMIT through the Chamber of Interpreters, and I was the first one to do so, to go through a training course. And you said there are 5 levels of different types of skills. I wonder how that's balanced if we look at recognition or an actual diploma and another accreditation.
Program actually recognition.
So the NAATI approval of the RMIT program would have been for Auslan English interpreter. So any accreditation would be as an Auslan English interpreter. At this stage, no approvals have been granted to courses for DI, but that's, I suppose, a natural progression at some point in time that it should be picked up as part of the diploma of interpreting. So when any NAATI approved course must have an object assessment of skills. as part of it. So in other words, if you go and do Persian at RMIT, you set something that looks like an RT test as part of the course. That means that if a course was to be approved for deaf interpreting, so if there was a diploma of interpreting, diploma of deaf interpreting, it would have to have some form of assessment for each of the skills if you were to be accredited in it. Just a couple of things. My email is here. If people have questions, they can email me directly. The other option is, because I do in and out of the office, but we have a general information email address, which is just info@nati.com. That's looked at on a daily basis by staff, and the emails are answered as quickly as we can. Given there's quite a lot of questions, I probably won't talk about the revalidation system or improvement in RT testing project right now. And if we've got time, I can talk about it at the end. But I think people have questions, so that's what to do.
Okay, I did see a hand back here, and there may be questions from some of the remote sites as well. So please post them on the Facebook. We do have some. Yeah. Great.
I've just got a person who's been watching online and then sent through a comment or question, so I'm just going to read out their question for them. So first of all, they're asking, am I able to actually meet the person, the client, perhaps who doesn't understand how to fill out an application form and provide them support, and how can I get a reference for them for doing that? And also, if I'm asking for a reference, does it need to be an interpreter organisation only, or any other recognised organisations?
We would expect one of the reference to come from an organisation we recognise as providing interpreting services. The second reference, we're much more flexible. It may come from an individual in the scenario set out. In terms of volume of work, we understand that there's likely to be relatively low demand, so we're not looking for people to have hundreds of assignments. We're simply looking for there to be some work over an extended period of time. So someone who may have worked and said, well, I've worked as a DI for 1 month and I've done 2 assignments, we're unlikely to provide recognition on that basis alone. We're looking for a more extended period of work experience. That's the question.
We'll see.
That was the same question.
It's the same.
Just 2 issues. Are we able to go back to the previous slide? You just hold on to that one. Oh, I think it's the previous to that. There's something about the English. No, I think it's forward. So just for clarification, my first question, looking at these points, you recognise the TAFE system. Do we have a university equivalent? So, for example, I've got 2 degrees, Bachelor of Education in Lote in Auslan. The second one is a grade diploma in Deaf Studies. So I've got 2 qualifications. And teaching Auslan, am I not recognised these categories? You think about mature aged entry, that's going to be different if it's up to year 12. So I'm just wondering if the TAFE system if this covers those aspects of and whether you're able to respond.
I think when you design any process, it's almost inevitable you miss things. And I think what we've established here is a general framework where if what you have is in excess of what we've asked for here, we would say it meets the requirement. I understand that that could be quite confusing, and it's probably something that's best dealt with before you make an application, so that someone could contact Nathi and say, hey, I've got this. On the surface, it seems to be far in excess of what you're asking, but is not on your list. Is it going to meet the requirements for English Auslan proficiency? That would give us a little bit of time to do some research, to talk to some people, and we would give you an answer before you apply.
Comment to that? Just to comment to that, and Robert, I think that's interesting, your response. We did, I guess the assumption is that a lot of deaf interpreters may or may not have gone on and gotten a college education, so, but many have. The issue is that how do you justify, how does a deaf interpreter prove that they are proficient in Auslan when it's been their language their entire life? So that's what we were sort of grappling with through this process. So if you've got to prove evidence of Auslan proficiency and you're a deaf person, it's your L1, it's your first language. So that's where that first criteria sort of came from. If you have a degree, even beyond that, then as Robert said, I think that, that is something that needs to be clearly stated in the booklet. But we're just starting this process.
I think the other thing is that from memory, the 4 applications we've received to date have all provided one of the deaf options. And it would seem on the surface that will be the primary mode of demonstrating Auslan proficiency. So my understanding is that that would be reasonably accessible to most people interested in this.
Just on the next slide, it talks about English and Auslan. It's another slide. I think you were talking about the Auslan to English. So if we're looking at a deaf interpreter recognition, under the Government Act, we need to use plain English for legal situations in a court context. So we're looking at how we change register in that context, and how would that apply to the information you provided today. So plain English is a bit of an issue.
So if I understand you, I think you're referring to the skill of a DI that will be recognized, where the DI is working between Auslan or English and a non-conventional sign language. Is that what you mean in a court setting? I want to make sure I understand your question.
Yes, so not a migrant, but another Australian person.
Okay. So I need you to ask the question again because I'm not sure I understand the question. That's okay.
Sure. So in certain areas, I've had conversations with deaf people who've had to adjust the register to kind of get the information across, almost get baby talk, you know what I mean, so plain English. And other DIs may not be comfortable in doing that, because obviously the deaf community is small. So I'm not qualified in encouraging them to ask the information in the way they need to receive it, but they're more confident in receiving information in plain English. So within the legal system, how do I interpret information appropriately for my client and not be seen as leading or sort of giving away responses or questions? And how does that fit in with this? Does that clarify things?
Yeah, I do understand your question. And I think interpreting in a court situation, is actually really requires a certain type of training to be able to match the needs of a variety of different deaf clients who present to the court. My experience working in courts with deaf interpreters in the United States has been that the deaf interpreter makes the adjustment to meet the needs of the deaf person's signing. Sometimes it's even a child or an adolescent. And the deaf person has that leeway to make that decision to adjust their language to be able to meet the needs of the client. The interpreter who's working in tandem, who gives voice to that, has to also make an adjustment to use language that's appropriate to the age and the linguistic ability of that person, if they were able to speak English. So it's a skill level. It's really an issue about training, and I know that when I work with a team interpreter, a tandem interpreter, I'm not interpreting what they're signing to the deaf colleague. When you work in a team, you support their work. Even if your team is a deaf interpreter, my team is a deaf interpreter in a court, they're interpreting, trying to make sense to the deaf client. I wait. I don't interpret that. And then when it comes back to me from the deaf interpreter, I present it in English in a way that the court sees that if this deaf person were a hearing person who spoke English, they might use certain words because of their age, or because of their cognitive level, or because of their education level, whatever education level that might be. So that's a technical decision that's made in the moment between the team of the deaf interpreter and also English interpreters. So that's really a training point, but it is a good point. I mean, I know sometimes judges will order that you have to interpret literally. And that's a whole other can of worms that's really related to training interpreters to work in teams in a courtroom. Does that answer your question? Yes, actually, any questions from the outlying areas? Yes. Okay.
I'll voice. Okay. So we've got a flood of questions from online. I'll try to get through some of them. Apologies to those watching online if I can't get through all of them. The first one was in regards to the minimum number of hours that you must have done for work experience. And I know that you said before there isn't a lot of work for deaf interpreters necessarily, but is there any sort of indication of minimum?
Currently, there is no minimum requirement. It's very much treated on a case-by-case. And as I said before, in a practical sense, that means in some languages we recognise people who have been on the books of a service provider for 12 months and done 5 or 6 assignments. In other languages, that there's people who have come to us and been recognised after doing hundreds of assignments over 3 or 4 months.
There's another question from South Australia in regards to getting a reference letter from a well-respected interpreter agency, for example, the Deaf Society, as opposed to another sort of agency that might not be held in such high esteem, or potentially somebody making up an agency. I'm just the messenger here. But basically the question is there going to be background checks to make sure that the references that are coming from accredited and well-respected agencies or organisations?
We've got quite a lot of experience in looking at references and judging the ones where there are issues versus where there's not. So because of the 2 requirements for references, it's not just filling out the sheet in the form and signing the bottom, it's also getting letterhead from the organisation that is providing the reference. It has a requirement to provide all of the contact details for the individual provider. We do quite regularly call the reference providers to verify that this is actually, first of all, that they've actually provided the reference, but also in many cases to ask questions about the organisation to ensure they understand the difference. We've also dealt quite closely with ASLEA about this process, and we continue to ask questions reasonably regularly of Laurie. And so if we're unsure, we will ask questions. When Paul Houston has been very forthcoming with his help and support at various times through this process as well. So we have plenty of places to go to ask about those sorts of issues. Does it mean that we might not ever make a mistake? You can never guarantee you don't make a mistake. But my experience is, should a mistake be made, we very quickly find out about it. Because someone turns up and says, "Oh, I've got this nasty credential," and they found out not to be able to do the job. And where we found people to have provided fraudulent information, we will remove their credential.
There's so many more questions. I don't know which ones to choose, and I'm not sure if you're going to talk about this later in terms of if there will be another course or some more training. I'll leave that one to you later because I believe you're going to speak about that one later. So people that have asked questions in regards to that, just hold tight. I'm sure there'll be something covered. There's also a few questions on here in terms of if deaf interpreters are just going to provide some sort of reference letter without having sat a test. There's concerns that there won't be a way to monitor their skills or verify their skills. So did you want to speak about that?
When we first started talking about this process with Laurie and ASLEA, it was very much a discussion about accreditation, which would have involved that performance-based testing. There are a number of issues from transitioning to an accreditation testing system, primarily around the way NAATI is funded. So NAATI receives no government funding for being involved in signed languages. That has been the case since NAATI was established in 1999. We continue to talk to government about changing that, but in a practical sense, establishing an accreditation test for paraprofessional interpreting in a spoken language typically costs us about $20,000 to go from no test to have a trained panel of examiners with test materials. We're very much in a situation currently where we're expected to function as a private company. So in other words, languages are expected to cover the costs associated with running testing in that language. So as I said, we continue, and this is an issue that was spoken, I've spoken a little bit about with Paul, and there's, I think, a joint commitment to try and establish a way forward with this so that accreditation testing does happen in the future as quickly as possible. This is really the first step. The feedback, particularly from my talks with Australian Deaf Blind Council, was that there was difficulties in service provision for deaf blind individuals because there was no credential. So interpreters couldn't be put on the books, even though they had a lot of work experience, because they had no NAATI credential. Therefore, there were many situations, including one involving the board member of the council itself, where they were being provided with Auslan interpreters who could not do the job. So it's very much seen as the first step. It's part along the process to have accreditation tests.
There's a lot of comments on here about further training and further courses, so we won't go over that again. The only other thing that I guess I just wanted you to touch on was that if people have concerns about somebody who's providing a service and whether they be an accredited Auslan to English interpreter or a recognised deaf interpreter, what is their best port of call for resolving that complaint? Because we often get a lot of those at ASLEA, and I just wonder if this is perhaps a good forum to just talk about how NAATI could be involved if people have concerns. And I think particularly if deaf interpreters are not going to go through some sort of testing, there needs to be some sort of mechanism where people can lodge complaints, I guess, if they're not happy with the service. And I'll leave it there for the minute.
I would say very quickly, NAATI has a complaints handling process, and we receive a number of complaints every year about the ethical or unethical behaviour of NAATI accredited or recognised interpreters. It's, I would say, unfortunately, the nature of the industry is that NAATI is a pseudo-regulator. So there's no legislation, there's no requirement to be NAATI accredited or recognised to work as such. While in many instances, policy determines that that's the case. There is nothing that exists like for doctors or nurses. So we are able to, in a limited way, investigate complaints, but a lot of the ones we get is, if I'm honest, a he said, she said type situation. You have the interpreter with one perspective about what's happened and the client with another perspective. Obviously, somewhere in between those two perspectives is what actually happened. And we do our best to mediate the situation, get good outcomes, and make, particularly in situations where on the surface it appears the interpreter's behaviour has been less than ideal, we very much hope that by NAATI being involved in the process and having a record of that, it sort of jars them into behaving differently in the future. But we have removed people's accreditations in the past, and we do that. So when a recognition is awarded, it's awarded on the basis of ethical behaviour. It's awarded for a period of 3 years. So we have something called the revalidation system. So it's not granted for life. It's granted for a period of 3 years, and it requires revalidation. Revalidation is granted on the basis of two things: continuing practice and professional development. You could add a third in there. We do look at whether there's a history of unethical behaviour as well as part of the revalidation process, but that's very much based on information we have at NAATI. But as the interpreter, you provide evidence that you've worked and that you've undertaken professional development. Now, although it says 120 assignments over the 3 years, there is some flexibility in languages of low demand. So there is a process, we deal with 225 languages. Some of those, there might be an interpreting assignment once a month. So it doesn't mean if you don't meet those requirements, you can't be revalidated, but there is an expectation that you meet professional development requirements. Because typically, professional development, and I know I'll be pulled up on this by somebody who lives in the rural and regional area, but typically professional development is accessible to most interpreters.
I think I just want to quickly clarify something that you mentioned earlier about the 5 skill areas of recognition. I'm wondering if a few are not accepted, and I think somebody asked a question about how many hours and there wasn't a minimum, but what's the minimum for the number of jobs that are accepted? It would be a good guideline to give us an idea of how many jobs would be accepted.
Okay. This is where it gets complex, because in some languages we have recognised people where, I'm trying to think of an example, Hebrew, for example, I think, where there is very few opportunities to do Hebrew interpreting. So in those sorts of situations, people have been recognised maybe with 5 or 6 assignments over a 6-month period, or a 12-month period. We don't publish minimums. It's the simple answer. It's very much treated on a case-by-case basis. And we do go out and, in instances, ask service providers about, well, how much work is there out there? Is it realistic to say this person should have more assignments than 1 or 2? Or is there so little work in this area that they've actually accepted all the work that's available in that language? So you must have some work experience, and you must have someone willing to say that they're happy with what you have done. As such, there's no minimum.
I'm just thinking, interestingly, you say there's might be little amounts of work out there, but the biggest problem is that people don't know that the service exists, and we need to educate. I think we need to educate Auslan English interpreters, deaf interpreters that could be resistant to the idea of deaf interpreters, and that deaf interpreters also, or deaf people, don't know that you can get deaf interpreters. So I think we need to get the message out there.
Steph, yeah, you actually raise a point that I was going to get to at some point. There's a lot of information that I plan to share with people tonight, but it's become evident, and I guess we expected this, that there would be a lot more questions about the recognition process, about some of these specific aspects of it, and that's great. I think it's good to see that people are curious, they've got questions. The issue of training, I'll answer your question. It's actually related to your comment and your question, Steph. It's regarding training. There is a need for more training, obviously, around the work of DIs. I was going to talk a little bit about the types of situations that DIs work in this evening, but we don't have enough time to do that. And it has become evident that we do probably need another workshop, another set of trainings around this. And ASLEA is fully aware and is prepared and has on the agenda to work with setting up some trainings specifically for DI skills. So that is definitely on the radar for ASLEA, so I do want to share that with you this evening. And the other issue that sort of relates to Steph's question has to do with what is the demand for deaf interpreting, as working with someone as a tandem as a deaf interpreter, and what does the community understand is the role of the deaf interpreter as a tandem. They see two Auslan English interpreters working in tandem, but people may not understand how a DI tandem works with an Auslan English interpreter. So there needs to be information, there needs to be trainings that go out to the broader community about the work. There needs to be training within the community to hearing Auslan English interpreters to know about making decisions about when they might actually benefit from having a deaf team. So this is all part of, I think, training that's really crucial for pushing this issue forward. So that's duly noted, and that is something that we have noted in the DI subcommittee in terms of our work. So I do appreciate that comment, and I'm sure maybe there are related comments out in the other areas that are attending this evening. In terms of the time that we have left, I was going to cover a little bit about some of the main issues pertaining to DI recognition and potentially future accreditation. But I think I'm going to hold off on that. We touched a little bit on that in some of these questions that have come up. Let me see. I'm also tasked this evening to present and talk with people, give a bit of an overview of ASLEA's deaf interpreter policy. Now, we don't have enough time, I'm thinking, to really do this, but I do want to I just want to mention it and tell you that it's open for comment at this point. ASLEA, we've sort of put together, the subcommittee, myself and Robin and a couple of other people in the committee have put together a ASLEA deaf interpreter policy draft. It's undergone several changes, but it's basically ASLEA's position on the work of deaf interpreters in our professional community. And so it's something that we would really like to see deaf interpreters who are out there doing the work, who want to do the work, or stakeholders in this policy, make some comments on. The policy, I'm trying to think if Paul has put it on the ASLEA site. I think, no, it hasn't been put up recently to me. We will make it available for public comments, and I know that people in the remote areas have a copy of it. I know the facilitators in those locations are made aware of the policy, that they were given a copy of it. And the expectation was after we wrap up here this evening, we're supposed to wrap up in about 10 or 15 minutes to let people talk about the policy. So what I'm thinking is, I might just touch on a couple of the areas that are explained in the policy, because the policy covers some of the role of the deaf interpreter and how that sort of works. It talks a bit about the typical situations where a DI can be effective. So this might be informational for people who are working as Auslan English interpreters, who may be thinking, well, I've been working this one case, and I've been feeling like I'm not being very effective. Some of this information might be helpful to working interpreters. Typical situations where a DI can be effective are working with children, working with a deaf person who may be charged with a crime, working with a deaf client who has disfluency, meaning Auslan is not fluent for whatever reason, whether it's cognitive impairment or they may have a mental health disability that at times they become disfluent and other times they're not. A variety of other language reasons might be why you might bring in a deaf interpreter. I'm not going to go through this list, but it is listed in the policy, and I would encourage people who are attending this evening to take a look at it. And Paul has opened up commentary period from now until the next several months because we'd like to finalize it at ANC this year. That's the annual ASLEA. So we do need commentary in. And I would like to basically let people make commentary in Auslan. If you want to send a video comment, I would appreciate that, and my email will be, I'll put my email up, so I'm willing to sort of collect video comments if you don't feel comfortable writing them on an English comment, but take a look at the policy, and if you want to submit comments in Auslan, that would be perfectly fine as well. So generally, the policy just talks a bit about not only the situations where DI is working, but how they would work in tandem with Auslan English interpreters. The accreditation talks a bit about recognition of deaf interpreters. It also talks about there's a definition of a deaf interpreter on the front page. It talks about some of the unique aspects of interpreting with sign language users in Australia, and it just sort of outlines some of the sort of the languages and the interesting linguistic situations that present themselves that need sometimes a specialist to come in and work with an Auslan English interpreter. So I think I'm going to leave it at that because the policy itself is pretty self-explanatory, and I don't want to take up too much time with it, but I do want to sort of stay within what was expected, that when we do sign off here, we're going to take some more questions on what we talked about this evening. When we do sign off in about 10 minutes from now, it would be great if the remote areas could note questions, and then if there's opportunity to talk about aspects of the policy, may or may not have time, write those questions down and email them. Paul did give his email to those areas for people to send comments to. So I'm going to open it up again for more questions on this DI recognition and this whole topic.
Okay, I know that we need to have recognition for DIs, but I'm just wondering, if I wanted to get recognition while I was working in the workplace, can that be acceptable, or do you have to have the experience before you get recognition? Because there aren't many people doing jobs, and they won't accept me if I was keen enough to do the work, but I don't have the experience. So could I join an organisation, do some work, and then get recognition? Is that possible? It's just really a question.
So, doesn't it have to be paid work for the agency as long
As Robert had said earlier, it doesn't have to be paid work, it can be voluntary. And also your question does point to the need for training. I've been an interpreter educator for a number of years and have had deaf people in my interpreting programs in the US. And there is a need here in Australia to establish a set of training to teach deaf interpreters how to do the work. And in that training, I can actually foresee the ability to have opportunities to be paired up with a mentor, to do some mock practice, to actually have some practice, some practical applications, like an internship period, where those could be established through some sort of a training module that might happen. And so there are lots of ideas being thrown around to try to figure out how to best provide training for people who may be interested, want to get training, and also want to get experience as well. So I think that might be something that could be put into some sort of training program.
If you want an expert, or you want experience, sorry, if I'm in a meeting, say, with another interpreter, and an organisation, would they accept me coming in as a trainee? as a trainee deaf interpreter. It may be a little confusing, it might be voluntary, it might be paid, or whatever, but you need to be aware of participants, whether they're going to accept a deaf interpreter as a trainee, and letting them know that I'm studying, and, you know, it could be a conflict there for some people.
I do see the point that you're making. Even when here in Auslan English interpreters are in training, sometimes, I'm not sure how it works in Australia, but I can say that what you can do is an agreement can be made between the organization that's hired the interpreter to come in. If they know that you're bringing a mentee or someone who's an intern into the situation, as long as that's clearly made, and the clients who are involved know that and have some say in that, generally that, I think, can be worked out as an agreement if you're trying to do some sort of internship or mentoring program.
The way I heard the information that's come across today, whether it be Nati or yourself, Laurie, from ASLIA, when we want to get in contact with the education, the trainers for interpreters, I'd like to throw into the ballpark here that we need to train deaf interpreters for legal and medical. Especially those two are the top priority. Other topics and areas definitely can be thrown into it, but I think that they're the two that we need to think about as significant areas.
I do agree with you, because most of the work that I've done in the past is in medical settings and in legal settings. But also, particularly in Australia, you've got lots of new Australians coming here. You've got people who are refugees or they're migrants in some way. So there's a real mix of languages that you might be seeing. So that's another, I would also assert that that's the third area that I think would be really crucial on top of deaf-blind training. Those are some really key areas that I think deaf interpreters could be trained in. I appreciate your comments.
I'm from ASLIA New South Wales. I think it would be worthwhile having members and professional improvement. I think it's worthy because professional development for Auslan interpreters, there might be a couple of deaf interpreters there. And I think experiences can be shared about what happens in the job. And I think it's worthwhile sharing that experience because that's helped me to develop my skills, learning from other interpreters, and Auslan interpreters learning from DIs. And I think that that's a really worthwhile way for people to develop their skills.
That's a very good point.
So a question from online, I think you may have mentioned this earlier. As part of the subcommittee, is there a deaf interpreter as a member of the subcommittee, or you are asking for people to be involved? Is that right?
We do have 2 members on the committee who are deaf interpreters, but as the chair of the subcommittee, I'm always looking for more input from deaf people who are working as interpreters. It's really hard to get that sometimes, and I really would appreciate if people want to email me or contact me if they're interested in serving. I can certainly bring that to ASLIA and say we've got other people who want to serve, and there's enough work to be done that certainly having that input would be appreciated.
Just looking at the highlights, I think, is this include Tasmania, is it Australia-wide? So you were saying it's going to be raised to A and C this year, is that correct?
The ASLIA, the ASLIA DI policy is like, on the ASLIA website, there are different position statements or policies around working in courts, I don't remember all of them, forgive me, but ASLIA wanted to establish a policy, some sort of a policy or guidelines around how to work with the DI, when does the DI utilize And so this document was put together this past year, at the same time that we're working on this DI recognition, as a way to have some information on the website for people who are curious about, well, what is this deaf interpreter, what does a deaf interpreter do? And so we need to have, as a professional organization of interpreters, some sort of a position statement and guidelines about the role of a DI and what a DI does, and just the situation, settings where a DI might be utilized. So that's what this policy is about, and it is meant to be Australia-wide. So this is ASEAN national.
Can I just raise something in relation to that? So previously Adrian talked about the legal settings and the medical settings and the need for training and what this, you talk about refugees or migrants. In the back of my mind I was thinking in relation to the third dot point here, unique aspects of sign languages, if you just go back a slide. Deaf interpreters, I was talking about the areas that they can work in. So that's great. I think the key issue here, looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the government recognises their needs on equal footing, but also we need to consider the word Indigenous. But what about the Pacific Islanders, Maoris, Samoans, and the people we may work with from those Pacific Islands? Shouldn't they be included in this special cultural linguistic group? Because I feel that in this point here, they're not necessarily represented. So it's something we need to keep in mind, because got somebody here who could probably tell us about this. Jodie's saying that some communities have up to 8 different languages within a community or a subgroup, so that's important to recognise it.
Exactly, and I think this is a sort of a typical situation where you might, I mean, if the language in the policy is not representing this group of people the way that those of you who work with these groups of people see it, then definitely send feedback about what you want in the policy that actually verbally states, such as what you said, that there are some communities, Indigenous communities, that have a variety of different languages that are not going to be met by the needs of an Auslan English interpreter. And I see Jodie's hand, so.
Thank you, Kim, for raising that question. So deaf Indigenous people in Australia, I mean, it's up to 50 different sign languages or systems to use throughout the country, but we also need to ensure that Indigenous people who are deaf interpreters need to have the understanding and the acceptance by the community at large first before they can actually work in that community. And another deaf person coming in may not work with the community if the community is not familiar with them or hasn't felt that trust at that stage. So they need to have cultural appropriateness. In some cultures, you can't actually use the hands and they rely on facial expression only. So if a deaf interpreter uses Auslan, they can be stuck in that situation as well. So we need to ensure that they're culturally appropriate. They're a culturally appropriate match in terms of the DI with that community. And it doesn't matter where they're from regardless, they need to be matched effectively and have an understanding of their language and culture.
How does NADI manage ensuring that interpreters, spoken language interpreters for Indigenous communities are actually provided in those? Maybe a response on how NADI manages that might be appropriate as well to this comment.
If I understand the question correctly, it's about how services are delivered to an individual or a group of individuals. So much of what we do, sort of ignorance of that is probably not the right word, but what we do is we provide a credential, we provide it in a particular language or combination of languages. How that then is used, we typically don't get involved in. Sometimes we get involved where we say, well, we've provided a Creole English interpreter, and subsequently they say, well, that works if they're Gurindji Creole, but it doesn't work if they're Roper River Creole. So we're always interested in feedback where something doesn't work, and so more recently Ngāti's broken Creole up into a number of different subgroups, so Fitzroy Valley, etc. So we're always interested in feedback. The way the Ngāti system works, unfortunately, looking at big groups. So I think the best example of this is Arabic. We accredit people in one Arabic language when in fact there are 30 spoken Arabics. That's the way the system has been since 1979. So sometimes there are things where simply for the system to function, bigger groups have to be, smaller groups have to be grouped together in order for awarding of a credential. It would be nice if Ngāti was funded in a way by government where that didn't have to be the case, but currently that's very much the reality of the situation that we function in, where you have to provide services at a macro level, or sorry, certification at a macro level rather than a micro level.
Is there a response? Is there a response to that? And then I have. Do you have a response to that comment, Jody? And then I have someone who has another question who's been waiting for a question.
It's in relation to Ngāti qualification or the recognition. So if I'm proficient in another Aboriginal language, another sign language system, so for example, the Warlpiri language in the Northern Territory, if they do have a language that I'm fluent in and they have an accredited course where they actually teach the spoken version, if I'm fluent in the sign language, does that mean that the 5 aspects of recognition within Ngāti can recognise another language such as an Aboriginal Sign Language?
Yeah.
So on my accreditation or my Ngāti card on the back, that'll actually say that this person can work in such an Indigenous or Aboriginal language. Is that correct?
Are you, just a clarification question, are you working between which languages are you working between? The Aboriginal language that you mentioned, and what's the other language are you working from? Auslan? Yeah, okay. That would be Auslan and some other conventional sign language. So, right, if they could show that they had training in the other conventional sign language, which is an Aboriginal language in that community, this would be perfect.
I think the question is, when we award recognition, would it say Auslan Warlpiri as the other conventional sign language? So this is something that I hadn't, it's new, this is a new thing for me. I think it makes sense.
Well, I've got 8. I've got
Yeah.
8.
I think it makes sense that if we're going to award that recognition, that you would specify what the other conventional sign language is. There's some.
You would identify each.
Yes, I think that makes sense, because if we award a recognition like that, there's no way to differentiate someone between Auslan American Sign Language and Auslan and an Indigenous Sign Language. So it makes sense. Does it mean we can achieve it immediately? The practicalities of that are difficult, but I think we have to look at it. So I'll start the process of saying how might we do that. We have awarded some recognitions already in other conventional sign language. I'm just not sure which ones. So yeah, so I'll have to look into that. So that's something I'll. I don't know who's the best person to talk to after I've investigated. Maybe Laurie's a good starting point. Yeah.
I'm really cognizant of the time. We do have a question that I know that you've been waiting, and 2 people are. These are the 2 last questions, and then I'm going to have to wrap up, but we can, it's obvious that we need to have another session to talk about this thing, so.
My question actually relates to this. So specifically the Auslan and other conventional sign languages. Auslan's fine, but let's say it's ASL, American Sign Language. How do I actually get the assessment for ASL if I live here in Australia?
That's actually a question that I've been thinking a lot about, because I know that I've worked with interpreters who have some ASL experience, but they still are not fluent enough to interpret into ASL for the needs of the deaf client. There's no mechanism, there's no way to test for that here in Australia, and I know that there's a request for ASL often because we see those requests across the community. So I think that that's yet another thing on the to-do list for trying to make sure that the professional group of interpreters in Australia are able to accommodate the needs of different types of sign language users in Australia in an appropriate way that it's actually qualified and it's a decent skill level. So I see your point. I don't know what the answer is, other than it's duly noted.
I just wanted to clarify one thing that you said earlier tonight. You talked about training, and you said somebody in New South Wales I think it was Diploma of Auslan, or attended a specific course in New South Wales, and I was the actual person who put that through that question. So the Diploma of Auslan, if you have completed that, that's just your information. I'm done. Hi, so just a comment and a response to a few questions on Facebook. There's a lot of questions coming through from New South Wales and Queensland, which is really good to see. But one question was asking for an agency perspective on whether we would actually start to employ those who have recognition over those who don't. And as you know, I manage also Victoria here at FDEV in Melbourne, and we always try to ensure we provide the best possible interpreting for any job or interpreter. So on the one hand, I would like to think that we would always give jobs to those with recognition, but really it's a catch-22 situation, because we have a lot of people who do want to become recognised interpreters. Where do they actually get the opportunity if we're giving the work to those with recognition? So I think it's a contentious issue, and we need to sit down with all the other agencies and work together with ASLEA and work out how we can actually provide those opportunities for those people to become recognised interpreters, but also ensure that recognised interpreters have opportunities to enhance their skills and knowledge. At the same time, it comes hand in hand with the catch-22 situation. So hopefully we can work together on that to focus on training opportunities for those people.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, it is 5 before 8, and I do want to allow some time for the people in the remote area to have some discussion on their own, hopefully about the draft DI policy, but if other questions arise, please take note of them, for those of you who are out there, and send those to Paul. I'm going to give you my email address, so if people want to submit comments in Auslan, you can email me a video, put it up on YouTube or something, and give me the link. My email address is, it's my name, but it's backwards. So it's my last name first, which is Why Not. It's WHYNOT. Then my first name, Lori, LORI, at gmail.com. So I'm happy to take video comments, and I can pass those on to ASLEA, Paul, and the National Executive Committee with comments on the policy and any other comments that pertain to DI recognition, DI training, the issue of deaf interpreters working in tandem with Auslan English interpreters, just working here in Australia, which will come to the subcommittee as well. So I think I'll wrap that up. I want to thank everybody for being here this evening. I think the questions have been fantastic. I'm really excited to see that there's a lot of interest in this, and people want to continue to have some dialogue about it. And I'll go back to ASLEA and sort of propose the idea that we need to have another session like this, perhaps. And in the meantime, I know that people may be going to ANC in, I think it's in August, ANC, in August. It would be nice for us to have some discussion there. That might be a good venue for us to come together as a professional community to talk a bit about DIs. What is the date?
When's the date?
August
27th.
27th to 29th August? No,
The 31st. 29th.
29th to the 31st of August. Okay, so that will be a good opportunity to have some discussion as well there, on site, face to face, which I know people like. All right, well, thank you, Robert, for helping with this. I think it's been very informative. I really appreciate it, and thank everybody for being here. Maxine is going to wrap up, I guess.
Great, thank you, Laurie and Robert. There's still some more comments coming in on the Facebook feed, so you can both have a bit of a read of that and feel free to reply if you feel so inclined. There's lots of questions still coming in about training, and I feel that's something that we probably need to, as you said, discuss at a later date. I don't think this is a topic that we could have covered everything in one evening, and that was never really the intention. We're just trying to, I guess, put it on the radar. It's something that's very new, although I know for a lot of deaf people in the community, this is something they've been doing for a long time, so it doesn't feel new. It feels like you've been waiting for it for a really long time. So I can understand that that's frustrating on lots of levels, but rest assured that ASLEA are working really, really hard with NAATI to make this happen, and they're all volunteers, and all the work that Laurie does on the DI subcommittee is as a volunteer, so she's not being paid anything for the work she does, and I just think that's important to keep in mind, that she's working not for herself but for the community of interpreters and the deaf community as well. So just with that, I would like to thank again here and also remotely Laurie and Robert. Thank you very much. We'll put up on our Facebook feed their email addresses if that's okay. So if you do have any other questions, there is a process that you can go through. We're also going to add the ASLEA DI draft policy. We'll pop that up on Facebook as a photo album, so you can go in and have a look and forward any comments that you might have to ASLEA. I'd like to say a big thank you again to VicDev and SLC for providing the support for the event to happen tonight, and in particular to Sasha and Niaz, who were helping with the technology. So thank you very much. And last but not least, we have to thank our wonderful interpreters, Julie and Mark, who did a fabulous job. It's really hard to interpret this sort of subject in front of a room full of interpreters, as well as interpreters all over the place watching the live feed, and I think they did a really great job. Thank you for all those people who posted comments and feedback on Facebook, and I passed all of that on, and they very graciously accepted it and did their very best to incorporate it into their interpretation. So thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate your hard work. So as Laura said, we're going to have a bit more of a discussion here in Melbourne. We did start a little bit late, but we're going to switch off the live feed. Feel free to post any more questions, and in the satellite sites, please have those discussions as well. Thank you.